Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Kristen, also known as Tens TBR. I don't really know how to do an intro, still new to this thing, but whatever. Today I'd like to do my January reading wrap-up. Last year I was not very good about doing wrap-ups, and last year I wasn't very good about posting, but this year, all of that's meant to change. Moving on, so in January I ended up reading 5 books, which was 2,115 pages ended up being read by me, which I think is pretty good. I think all of my books were at least 300 pages, but less than 500 pages this month, and my average rating was 3.85 stars. So overall I think I had a pretty good month. I only did 1 reread, and the other 4 were all new books to me. So the first book I ended up finishing this month was The Radium Girls by Kate Moore, which is a nonfiction book, and I read it in audiobook format. Basically, The Radium Girls is a nonfiction work about following teens and young adult women during World War I. The United States, we had multiple corporations, of course, and we were fighting in World War I and things like that. Within this war, there were obviously pilots. It was like the first aviation fighting that we've ever really had in the history of world wars and the history of war. These women basically got employed at these companies that were like radium factories that basically all they had to do was, in airplanes and stuff, they have meters and dials to tell them the random stuff, not random to them obviously, but things needed for aviation, like elevation, blah blah blah, whatever. And what these women were employed to do was to paint the dials that would eventually be installed onto these airplanes, and paint them with radium paint that is bioluminescent that we know, so it kind of ends up glowing and helps it so that the pilots would be able to read and get the readings from the dials at night. And as we know now, radium is actually very, very dangerous. Which at the time, it was not really known as dangerous as it is now. It was almost kind of viewed as a miracle drug. They were using it to try to cure cancers and a bunch of different things like that. It goes on to the brief history of radium, not super in depth, but a little bit. And it mostly ends up following these women and these girls that were forced to work at this company, and the practice that was taught at this company, because they were very stingy with their paint and their work. Of course, as we know, corporations' goal is to extract as much profit out of the worker as possible and extract as much profit as possible for their higher-ups. These companies, the bosses, the higher-ups and stuff, taught these girls that the way to paint and the best way to have a more accurate brush is to stick the paintbrush in your mouth and wet it and sharpen it to a point, so that whenever you are painting with the radium, it is more precise, more exact, and you end up using less of the radium paint because you're more exact of where you're putting the paint and things like that. And so we know obviously how dangerous it is to put radium directly into your mouth and to directly be working with it so closely with no protections. These women had no gloves, no aprons, nothing to protect them from radium directly being put into their system and onto their skin. And it really goes into the history of that, and these select women that unfortunately lots of women did end up getting hurt in multiple ways, where it goes into really graphic detail about what the radium ended up doing to a lot of these women's bodies. It's a very heartbreaking story. It's hard, but honestly, it's really important. It's not something that I ever learned in school, or anybody that I know has ever learned in school about specifically this, which these women did make a difference in World War I, because they were obviously, every worker is important to the different, no matter how small their part is in labor or creating something, whether it's adding a button onto something or doing something small, every single step is required by a laborer. And me being a Marxist, I understand this. And so you kind of, the goal of capitalism is to separate workers from labor, and so we are increasingly separated by this. And I think this does a very good job to show you that every point in the creation of something, every labor that is used to create something great or something of importance is important, and they're still relevant, and what they do is still needed by society. And what these girls did and what they went through is utterly devastating. It's honestly a heartbreaking read. It's a really heavy read. I really liked the book. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I think it does a great job showing like the true history and the graphicness, because history is not pretty, and this history is especially not. It's especially harrowing and gross and sickening what these corporations do to innocent and poor people to prey on them to extract as much labor and profit, because these companies ultimately care more about money than they ever do about any of their workers. And I do really like it. I do think some of it ended up being a little repetitive with just how the story structure was, in my opinion, because it's almost written not like a true like nonfiction where it's facts. It very much goes into the individualness of these women's lives, and you kind of get to see all around them like the different things that you might have not originally like thought of or realized, and especially things like this. It does a really great job of humanizing them. It does. My problem is with the court, it ends up being very repetitive, and the way that the court system is obviously very sickening, and it was a lot of court that these women ended up having to go through to try to get some compensation for the tragedy that was their life. And I also did listen to this on audiobook, which is, I think, another reason why I probably didn't like it as much, where it's not like a perfect 5-star read for me. I'm not an audiobook girly. Anybody that knows me, I don't like listening to audiobooks with no visual stimulation. I'd rather just sit down and read a book. Or if I were to like listen to an audiobook, I probably would prefer a tandem read over just straight audio, just because I feel like I can't process the information just hearing it. I'm just not like an audio person, like an audio learner in any way. So I think that might have affected me, but I do think it's a really good book, and I do really think it's worth reading for anybody and everybody, especially if you're not somebody who's super into nonfiction, because it almost feels like it's written in like a journalistic way, so it feels like almost that it is a fiction book. If you're somebody that only reads fiction, I think this might be a good transition for you to introduce yourself into reading more nonfiction, because I do think nonfiction is a necessary thing that we all must do. I do think it's very good. I think most people, if you need a nonfiction to read, this is a great one. I think it does a great job, and I don't think it's honestly that the audiobook is very long, but I think the actual book is under 400 pages for a nonfiction that feels very natural. I think it's very good. Moving on, the second book I ended up reading this month, Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I read this physically. This is a story that ends up following Victor and Eli, 2 ex-best friends who are also superheroes, kind of. The way that the superheroes are in this are not like Marvel or DC in the way that they're superheroes. I classify them almost more as like X-Men type of superheroes, and the way that the society views the X-Men and the mutants, and about how they have like a very negative connotation. That is how like these superheroes in Vicious are sort of classified as, where people are scared of them, they don't trust them, they don't go out in the world and stop crime. They're typically kind of more like outcast in a way, but they're very underground still. Not a lot of people know who they are. I don't want to say too much of this because I did really enjoy this. I gave it 4.5 stars, and I do think it's kind of best to not know too much about it. I think you can read like the back of the blurb or whatever, which is basically what I'm gonna give you, but I don't think there's too much that I can say without like, let me just say it and then you be the judge. So again, you follow Victor and Eli, which are 2 ex-best friends, where Eli is basically directly responsible for Victor ending up in prison, which you don't really know why he ended up going to prison or what led to their falling out. You get 2 timelines of this. You're following them 10 years ago whenever they are best friends, and then the present day, and then all the time in between. It jumps back and forth. Every chapter is like a different section in time basically, or a different location, and you kind of end up finding out why Eli made Victor go to prison, and then what Eli does now, where he's not necessarily morally righteous to be outside of prison, because his goal is to eradicate and kill every other superhero, or they call them EOs or extraordinaries in the book, and Eli's goal is to kill every other EO because they're not in God's picture of the world. This does have a lot of religious themes and elements, which I'm not somebody who grew up very religious, so I'm sure if you are somebody who did grow up very religious, you could probably get those out of this better than I ever could, and definitely be able to critique and respond to them in a much stronger way than I could. But I thought it was a very good critique of the whole, like, there's no hate quite like Christian love sort of ideals that we especially see on the internet and people around the world, where a lot of Christians have become so separated from their faith and the way that they view other people, and the hate that they really do spread a lot of the time, whether it's anti-LGBTQIA plus people or racism or poor people, and they're not truly loving thy neighbor or like the true core works of Jesus. I think this does a great critique of like almost like the American Christian, I guess you would say, like the white American Christian evangelical idea that is definitely very relevant like within US culture and what the United States knows. And I think this does a good job at critiquing that and like showing that. It's honestly not what I was expecting from V.E. Schwab. I've only read one other book by her, and it was Gallant by her. I read that a few years ago, so I don't really remember too much of it, and I remember I liked it, but this is very good. I mean, even like the tropes, found family, which anybody knows, you can see behind me, I have a very beautiful Shadow and Bone display. Six of Crows is one of my all-time favorite books, and so found family trope, I'm just everything I wanted in this. I really enjoyed it, and I think it is everything that I could pretty much want in like a very pseudo like science fiction-esque kind of novel. It's science fiction-y, but it's also very grounded in reality. I feel like it's almost like I originally compared it to X-Men, but I also do think if anybody was a fan of the show The OA on Netflix, I think it very much gives those kind of vibes as well, but maybe not so supernaturally. But I do think I can see the similarities to that, so I think if you like The OA or if you like X-Men, I think you would really enjoy this. It's a duology, I guess, the duology, which we'll talk more about the second book when I get to the second book, because I did read it this month. I do have thoughts, but I think this is a very strong book, and I enjoyed it very much, and it does make me interested to check out more of V.E. Schwab's work. The next book I read, the third book I read this month, was The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a fictional book, and I read it on digital. Basically, okay, so I feel like if you're in left-wing spaces, you are aware of this book. If you're not in left-wing spaces, or I guess if you're old, the classics-esque area, you would be more in the realm of knowing about this book or hearing about it. I had only heard about it because I'm in left-wing spaces and everyone's like, oh, this is like, I knew it was anarchist, so I can't really hold that against it, but I can. But I knew a lot of like leftists, quote unquote, or anarchists were kind of taking this as like theory and like what they think their ideal future society would look like, which is interesting to say the least, because if you kind of end up reading this book, it ends up discussing about synopsis. Let's go into that. I think this book is written very confusingly, and if you're not somebody that can kind of stick through like kind of not a lot of plot happening and mostly characters thinking and mentally like doing things like that where they're not in reality, it's a very thought-provoking philosophical type of book rather than it being your true dystopian sci-fi book. It's not plot. It's a lot more of you sit down, you read a chapter, and you think, and you reflect, which is fine if that's what you're looking for, which I can be looking for sometimes, but I just don't think in this book it was well done, which, again, I keep talking about my feelings of the book when I need to talk about the synopsis, but my problem is that it's kind of, the synopsis is that, like, you follow Shivek, okay? He's a physicist from this planet called Enaris. Sorry about my pronunciations, again. It's fictional, so don't get too upset. You follow this physicist who is a very smart and capable man, and you kind of come in onto him where he's leaving Enaris, which is supposed to be this utopian, communist, anarchist society, whatever you expect, where this moon that he is from, there's lots of like original. It's also very hard to talk about too if you're not ingrained into like left-wing literature, I think this is, I don't know. It's like how I was recommending Radium Girls to people who don't read nonfiction to read Radium Girls. This is like the inverse. So like if you read only nonfiction and you want to get into fiction, the Dispossessed will probably be great for you. I typically prefer fiction, so I didn't feel the draw to this because you're following Shivek, a physicist from this utopian society, which you learn about how it is and the structures of it and what goes on, and eventually why he left, which is like the main like overarching plot point to why he ended up leaving this place that is almost viewed as like, it's obviously very different than what we know. He goes to this capitalist society, which I think represents like America in a very clear and concise way, where there's so many like great things because like all of the people on Eurus, which is the capitalist moon, they have so many luxuries, they have so many rich things, their stomachs are always full, they're never dealing with any of this, versus these are things that they do end up dealing with on the communist moon. And the reason why Shivek ends up thinking this is because they're too isolated, too blah blah blah, whatever have you. He has his own thoughts and opinions, while the other people that are from that moon also have their own thoughts and opinions, because it is told almost not similarly to Vicious by B.E. Shaw, but similar in a way where you're in the past one chapter, the next chapter future or present, however you want to declare it, future, present, whatever, and then back to the past, back to the future. Like, it's overlapping timelines that I think are done very confusingly because it doesn't originally say that there are different times, it just says the different locations, and so you're kind of, the first couple of chapters, it's not very clear that they are two individual times, not coexisting all throughout time. It's not chronological in any way, and I think you kind of get the vibe that it is, that you're almost following like different people on different planets and different things, and I think it's told very confusingly where you don't really understand till at least 3 or 4 chapters in. I think that the different moons listed on the top is the moon that it's kind of taking place from. Me and Mariah did a full podcast episode, my best friend Mariah, who we have a podcast together, Literary Liberation, if you haven't heard of it, where we do fully go into depth. I go into my full thoughts. Again, just wasn't a book for me, and if you want to see Mariah praising it because she did end up loving it a lot, you can go over there and listen to our discussion about it, because I don't want to go too in depth into this because it was really just something that wasn't for me. It was so dully written. I felt like I was pulling teeth anytime I was picking it up. I like the overall message that it ends up having because, like, being a Marxist objectively, like, it is good to see revolutionary people and revolutionary ideas and like communism shown in a positive light. I do appreciate that, but I just could not look past the way the writing style was, and it felt to me like it did feel dated too, especially looking at like history now and about how like things were viewed then and how it is now, and about how much worse capitalism is now and things like that. So I do think it is a good read, and it's worth the read if you are somebody that is super ingrained and you want positive representation of socialism. I do think this is a good book for that. But if you're someone who likes similar writing styles to me, I think that's where my main problem was. I could not get past the writing style. Just was not for me. It felt, as a classic, it felt too much like a classic. I'm not a big classics reader. I mean, I have read some classics. I already finished another classic today, which I'll talk about in my February wrap-up, because I read it in February, and I do like some classics, but this one just was not my taste, not for me, and that's okay. I will leave it for someone else to enjoy. The next book I ended up reading this month, Vengeful by V.E. Schwab, which I always want to call this Vengeance, so sorry if I end up doing that. Spoiler alert, I probably will. I don't want to go too much into the plot of this book because, again, if you haven't read Vicious, you haven't read Vengeful, because this is the second book in the duology. I will say, though, because I won't say anything really too much, like, for real, because, again, read Vicious if you haven't, and then you can come back for my review of Vengeful. If somebody would really like my in-depth spoiler review, I could do that, but I don't think it's worth spoiling the first book, because I just feel like you just heard me praising the first book. I loved it. Basically couldn't put it down. So far, probably my favorite read of this month, I'd say, is the highest read. This book, why does it exist? Why? V. Schwab. You could tell me, but you can send me a little DM, because the first book is very well written. This was well written too, not even to say that. And I guess the first book did have loose ends, but honestly, it ended perfectly for me. It was open-ended, yes, but there was a complete enough conclusion that I felt satisfied and satiated with myself for finishing that book. This book expands on some things, yes, and wraps up the openness of the other book, but again, it never felt really necessary. Some of the new characters that were introduced were not really my favorite perspectives to have. I kind of liked the core cast of Vicious, and whenever this was on the core cast of Vicious, I enjoyed it, but whenever it was kind of following other new characters that were introduced, I felt some sympathy for them, but I was not as nearly invested in their story as I was for these other characters, and I just feel like it wasn't necessary. It was a lot longer than the first book. I think it was like almost like an extra 100 pages or so, and I don't know if that was necessary at all. It felt, I gave it 3.5 stars, which looking back, maybe I might bump it down a little bit to maybe a 3. I don't know. We'll see how that is whenever it gets posted, because it's still well written. I liked V. Schwab's writing. I liked the story, and I'm mostly confused to why there is going to be a third one. I don't really feel like this was necessary. I wish maybe if this was an existing book, it just fully committed to the new EOs only and not even like reference the core cast of this, where you do end up getting some backstory for certain characters, and not that I do think build upon their character, yes, but I just felt like that part could have been a novella maybe, and this could have been focusing only on the new EOs, if that's like where this is gonna go. I just feel like it wasn't fully necessary. It wasn't really my favorite read. I liked it. I read it pretty quickly. I think I read it in like a couple days. Again, I think the religious themes and stuff are still relevant to this. It just almost felt like a rehashing of the first one in a way. These could all be standalones, interconnected standalones, where they're in the same world, but with their own characters and their own stories and their own focuses. But I think the third book is again going to focus on some more characters that were in both of these books, which is fine, but I feel like sometimes you can let them have their stories. You can let them live. That's their business. You don't need to keep rehashing it, which I do think this is worth the read. If you like the first one, you're going to like this as well. But again, it's not like, I don't think this one is necessarily revolutionary or felt like really anything new. I feel like it's just kind of, it's a book. I liked it, and I will probably end up reading the third one because I am a big completionist and I like everything to be the way that it is. It's fine. It wasn't my favorite read. I think it's just fine. I think I was ultimately left a little disappointed because I did enjoy the first one so much, which this one is fine. Again, overwhelming sentiment is it's fine. It's fine. I swear. It's good. You can read it and you'll like it. I don't hate it. I promise. I just wish maybe that there was a little bit more to it. I was looking for that special sauce, and it wasn't quite in this book, which I don't think that means it's not in any V. Schwab book. I just think maybe the series is going to be dragged out, and I don't think we need to beat a dead horse for money. I'd like to see new ideas where not necessarily I want to be outside of the world of not seeing any more EOs. I think they're so unique. There's so many different powers that they could all have, whether they're trivial or super powerful is awesome. I just wish sometimes maybe we don't need to keep seeing the same characters all the time. That's my opinion. Not saying that I don't love Victor, because I do like him a lot. He is a very fun character to read about. Just maybe I think he needs some rest, especially after this book. His story, he needs a break. The final book I ended up reading this month was The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Of course, this is a fiction book, and I read it physically. I began tabbing it, and I kind of gave up halfway through because I was just into the story. So, I have read The Hunger Games before. This is not surprising. I am a Gen Zer. Of course, I read this book whenever it came out. I did read, like, Catching Fire and Mockingjay later in life, but I did not read them. I liked the first book whenever I read it in middle school, and then I just never felt drawn to finishing. Later in my adult life, I did finish Catching Fire and Mockingjay. I love the whole series with its entirety. But again, caveat, as a Marxist, these books are a little too sympathetic to liberalism, in my opinion. Not necessarily in the first one, so I will only talk about the first one here, and I will probably do a bigger rant later on about Mockingjay and the way that it is. But I think, of course, I'm doing this reread right now because everyone knows, and if you don't know, the mid-March-ish, a new Hunger Games book's come out where we're following Haymitch Games is something I'm very excited for. I loved A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I liked Catching Fire and the Hunger Games are some of my favorite dystopian novels. I think Mockingjay is fine. Just overall thoughts right now. But if you don't know, I guess, let me talk about this as if you don't know the Hunger Games, which is like, if you don't know the Hunger Games, what rock have you been living under? Because that's crazy. And I love rereading books leading up to new releases of books in a series. I am a big rereader, and so that is why I want to reread this, so I can get as much out of the newest book that I think could possibly got out of. But for those of you that don't know, this is a dystopian novel following Katniss Everdeen, this is a dystopian novel taking place in the futures of North America, where it becomes Pan Am is the country, and you end up following Katniss Everdeen, a poor girl from District 12, which is the North America is basically split up into a bunch of different districts, 1 through 12, and this is 12 being the poorest. Katniss Everdeen is from this poorest district, and because they live in like a fascist society, every year they hold an annual competition called the Hunger Games, where it is basically 2 teenagers from each district, 1 through 12, is chosen at random. Their names is drawn out of a bowl, and they are forced to fight in a battle royale for the entertainment of the rich people of the capital. And that's like the basic of the story. I think there's a lot more nuance, and there's so much more to go into within this. I think this is like one of the foundations for dystopian books, and it is honestly like the fact that this book came out in 2008 and it is still so relevant to now in the times, and it is relevant for everyone to read, and I think everyone enjoys it. I think the Hunger Games series will be like how we view the Lord of the Rings here in like 50 years. Like, it is, we have a modern day classic on our hands. And I think if you haven't read this, or if you even haven't seen the movies, you need to consume this in some type of way. Not because it is like supposed to inspire you for rebellion or anything like that, because I think that is one thing that a lot of people that are unprincipled online, they read this and they're like, I'm the next Katniss Everdeen. No, you're not. Sit down. But I do think this is a great way to look at yourself more critically, look at your government more critically, and look at the different things going on in the world with a more critical eye, and see how the things that media plasters on our television as what is entertainment and what is violence and what is whatever else. Because I do think The Hunger Games does a great job in discussing that, especially with certain, I don't know what all I can say on YouTube, so I'm sorry if I'm being too vague. But as we know, there are different wars and things going on, and how much of it is for the entertainment of the rich and wealthy to profit off of, and how much of it is actually a necessity to be fought. Because in my eyes, and in most Marxist eyes, is that a lot of war is irrelevant and for profiteering rather than it is for the well-being, because there's no way that this violence is like a necessity for anything, versus like I think it does a great job at showing to you too about like how people fighting back is viewed as violence, but then these inherently like violent situation these teenagers are put in is not viewed as violence by capital eyes. I think it's a very thought-provoking book, especially since it is young adult. Like, it is meant for 12-year-olds to read it, and I think that is such a great thing to make so accessible for children to be able to read this and to be able to connect with the story and learn about the story. I think it is, I cannot praise the Hunger Games enough. I do really love them, and I think like children in the future should read them, and why this story was born at all is such an interesting topic and an interesting thought that honestly so good. Like, I cannot praise this enough. I gave it 4.25 stars, which, again, there are some scenes and stuff. I don't want to hold this against the Hunger Games. I don't like first-person perspective. Hot take, I know. Whatever. It's done fine in this. Again, I think if it was third person, if it was more objective, my problems with the Hunger Games too is that it's not committing enough, because the reason why I think the Hunger Games are so popular, because it's popular in the left, but it's also popular like in the right. There's a reason why like there's blockbuster movies about this versus like The Dispossessed does not have blockbuster movies. This is something that can almost pander to any audience without having, like, if they don't have a critical eye and they are not aware of different marginalized groups and different ways that communities and stuff are restricted by capitalism. I think it doesn't commit enough to critiquing capitalism in a way that it's almost like, it's like right there, it just needs to be shoved. And I think like if Suzanne Collins like read like some Marx, some Rosa, anybody else like that, Michael Parenti, she could have created a beautiful trilogy that could be something more. And I'm hoping that the new Hunger Games, which like I kind of doubt, because like Suzanne Collins is like a liberal, which is fine if you're, it's fine. As a Marxist, you have to be able to read these things and draw different conclusions and things like that, and look at why this was able to be, it's a banned, is it even a banned book? It might be a banned book. The way that this is banned is not the same way that other books are banned in different ways, where like, I just think in a capitalist society, you have stories that are being made into movies, made into TV shows, like George Orwell books. You just need to make sure you're thinking critically about why these are able to be thrust into the limelight, not only because like, oh, they ended up focusing more on the love triangle in the movies than they did the actual rebellion, blah blah blah, which is like not necessarily true, but the reason why they're able to, there's a reason why they don't have to be so committal, and then these books still are almost universally loved by most people, because people cannot see the similar, like the people that see the similarities to America view it in a left-wing light, but then there's also people that view it as like, this is what the future communist country would look like, is Pan Am, blah, 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 sort of ideas. And I think that's the main hindrance I have with the Hunger Games. They're not strong enough in their critique of capitalism. They fall into the neoliberalism trope where it's like, anybody with authority is bad sort of vibe. And it's just not necessarily my cup of tea in that way, but I do think they're really well written, and I do think that like children in schools could read this and you could extract so much more than this, and I hope it makes people think more rather than just taking this as gospel or taking this as word, because these are very good books and they are very entertaining, yes, but they are not real life, they are fiction, and we need to learn and grow and maybe look at actual history sometimes, is my main overarching sentiment. Other than that, that is what I've read this month. I think I had a pretty good reading month. My goal this year is 60 books, so as long as I stay on track and read at least 5 books a month, which I did this month, I will reach my goal. So if you have any comments or questions, comment below. If you have any recommendations, I will take them. And here's hopefully to another great reading month. It's February 1st and I've already finished my first book, so things are looking good because February is a short month. So I gotta get grinding. For watching!